Welcome to Hub-Bub, the People's Podcast, where we engage our citizens and investors with the activities of the Planning and Code Administration and encourage everyone to contribute to Hagerstown's growth.
Well, welcome to the February edition of the Hub-Bub Podcast. It's nice to be with you all today, especially Donnie Harcum.
Sean Brown, how are you?
I'm doing good. I have to admit it's a little bit weird seeing you because I don't see you as much.
Yeah, I know. It's we're in now the office so much, just trying to be safe at work, and we don't see each other as often, so we're kind of preparing these podcasts remotely and then come together for the show. So some little inside baseball there for everybody.
Yeah, I think this conversation right here is the largest one we've had in the past month.
I think so.
Yeah. Well, it's good to be with you today.
It's good to see you.
Yeah. We are living in historical times, aren't we?
We are. Yeah. Very good point.
Yeah. I didn't pick that word historical by accident.
No?
No. Don't act like you don't know what I'm talking about. Our podcast today is dealing with historical structures.
Yes.
Yeah. Again, it's one of those things, it may not be the most entertaining information to really take in and listen to, but the fact is that no matter where you live, there are historical structures. And you can look at them and just take them for granted.
Exactly. It's one of those things, as I get older, I appreciate a lot more, especially living here in Hagerstown, just learning some of the history in some of these buildings and knowing, what they've been through, who has lived in some of these buildings. It's very cool. So.
Yeah. So this podcast is really going to kind of just be informative, as all of ours are, in the sense that, when we look at historic structures, is it an accident they're still there, that they're still in place, Again, we can take them for granted, but our podcast today, I think, is an interesting one in the sense that it will really help our listeners to understand, what really goes into historic structures, what keeps them in existence all of these years. And of course, we'll even talk about Hagerstown, how a lot of these historic structures, how they've contributed to the growth of the city. And I really think, even with me, as I was reviewing the information, it will generate more appreciation for old structures, commercial, residential.
No, you're absolutely right. So like you said, we're going to talk about Hagerstown. We'll discuss, nationally and worldwide even, where these historic structures come into play. So, but before we get into why they exist, we have to talk about what exactly a historic district is. So historic districts are designed or designated areas recognizing a group of buildings, properties, or sites by one of several entities on different levels as historically or architecturally significant. Buildings, structures, objects, and sites within a historic district are normally divided into two categories: contributing and non-contributing. Districts greatly vary in size. Some have hundreds of structures, while others just have a few. Historic districts are all around the world. Not only do they exist in the United States, but also in Canada, the United Kingdom, and Iran, just to name a few of them. And, how did historic districts in the United States begin? Well, our earliest preservation efforts in this country tended to be efforts to save threatened homes of Revolutionary War era heroes, and then to save battlefields as national landmarks. Two famous efforts were in the mid-19th century by Pamela Sue Cunningham to raise funds to save Mount Vernon, and a legal battle in 1896 between the federal government and a railroad company over the intent to save the Gettysburg battlefield. I know I've been to Gettysburg before. It's kind of like in our backyard. It's been a while, and it's a place, like I said, I appreciate as I get older, some of this history, and I definitely want to go back there. Have you been to Gettysburg?
Yeah, actually, after my wife and I got married, who's from Gettysburg.
Oh,
we lived in Gettysburg for a couple of years.
Okay.
And in those 2 years, I think I went to every museum, took every tour, taking the bus tours, and they incorporate a lot of the history of the buildings in some of the guided tours. I was pretty blown away.
That's awesome. You actually live there.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. And you think about history in perspective, even though, you can go way back in the country that we live in, compared to the rest of the world, it's pretty new.
Right.
Pretty
Absolutely.
new. Yeah. So countries in the past have always recognized the need to try to preserve structures, but here in the United States, they had to recognize that as time went on, from the very beginnings, that, hey, listen, if we don't do something, these structures are going to be gone. Mm-hmm. So let's do something to protect them. And so back in the early 1900s, there were some laws that were created to protect these structures. So, for example, the 1906 Antiquities Act, what that allowed for is to take designated historic landmarks owned by the federal government and protect them. And then there was the Historic Sites Act of 1935, and what this did is gave the Secretary of the Interior the authority to document historic sites and to acquire historic sites. So those were kind of the beginnings of being able to, say, we want to take these structures and we want to protect them, we want to designate them, set them aside for something important. And so while these laws brought recognition and certain protections for federally owned designated landmarks and documented historic sites around the country, what they didn't do was protect privately owned site from urban renewal activities. What could happen is, so you've got these old historic buildings, now because of growth, they want to build new structures, and it could have been very easy to tear down an old structure without giving it a thought, and then it's lost forever. There's nothing, it's gone, yeah. But it would take another 30 years before stronger controls were created at the federal level. So it was just a beginning, but it was going to need a lot more.
Right. Okay, so those were the federal protected areas. How about non-federal protected areas or structures? It often took the loss of important historic landmarks or the intrusion of out-of-scale modern buildings in beloved historic neighborhoods or areas to bring about changes necessary to create change and to create local historic preservation ordinances and controls. Often it was the clearance activities by urban renewal authorities or the federal government that sparked the necessary community outrage to convince local governments to act. Historic preservation then started on local government levels. So early historic district preservation efforts at the local government began in the 1920s and the 1930s, all the way up to the mid-1950s. Those early efforts used as their justification for historic district controls to encourage and preserve the local tourist industry, since it was felt the courts would be most likely to uphold economic arguments rather than aesthetic arguments. They also covered districts rather than landmarks, so everyone was affected, not just a few of them.
Yeah. It really interesting history there. Again, recognizing the need because, hey, if we don't do something, they're going to be gone. So that's happened throughout the United States. All different parts of the United States recognize that they need to do this. And just about everywhere you go in the United States, particularly your major cities, are going to have some type of historical district identified within its city, sometimes multiple, as in the case of Hagerstown even. So just to give you an example of some of the historic districts that were created in America and when. So New Orleans, like the French Quarter, 1925 to 1936. Charleston, South Carolina, a very historic town, 1931. San Antonio, 1939. Old Town Alexandria, and here in Virginia, or Pennsylvania. I think I'm still in Virginia. 1946. Williamsburg, been there a few times. That is a cool place to visit, especially for structures. 1947. Old Salem, Winston-Salem, North Carolina. 1948. Georgetown, I've been there. That's a pretty cool place.
Mm-hmm. It really is.
Yeah, they've done a lot with that area. I appreciate Georgetown because you got a lot of old structures, but they got modern uses, and it's a nice mix.
Right.
But Georgetown didn't happen until 1950. Annapolis, another historic town. I've probably been there, I'm sure. Mm-hmm. 1951. Boston, 1955. So, that's what attracts, things like this is what a lot of times cities will use to attract visitors, people from out of town. Hey, come see our historic areas and see how we've done so well in preserving them. So, yeah, it's really, really important. And, we look at it, it gives it gives you a certain feeling when you're able to go to these cities and visit them.
Oh, absolutely. It's like a step back in time, especially you mentioned Williamsburg. I know for me that was definitely a step back in time going there. It was very cool to visit there. Also Boston. That was another fun one to go to. I spent a lot of time in San Antonio when I was in the military, so seeing a bunch of those structures was really cool. So
Cool.
yeah, it's a cool list to look back on and seeing how early some of them actually existed or started. So now we'll talk about the 1978 Supreme Court case that recognized aesthetics. So the Penn Central Transportation Company versus New York City Supreme Court case that recognized aesthetics as a proper basis for use of police powers by a local jurisdiction. And we'll start with that one. So this case also found that requiring preservation was not a takings of the financial value of the property because the owner was not denied all reasonable economic use of the property. This decision led to the strengthening of a lot of local ordinances to control demolition activities. The Penn Central case was over plans by the railroad company in 1969 to undertake a project at the Grand Central Station terminal that would severely affect the historical character of the terminal. The local preservation community would have been still smarting, over the loss of the historic Pennsylvania Station in 1963 to make way for Madison Square Garden. So, now Grand Central Station is a beautiful area and it's on a lot of people's bucket list to visit there. Have you ever been to Grand Central Station at all?
No. Not that. I've been to the one in New York, but
yeah,
that's pretty cool.
Yeah, that one is awesome. So, yeah, I can't imagine that not being there at this point. It's pretty wild that it took a Supreme Court like this, just a Supreme Court case, to get to that point. So.
Absolutely. So, again, it took a lot of action on people and time and energy to preserve these things, to put these things into place. And so there were a number of programs that helped to do that. For example, there was what's called a Modern National Preservation Program, and out of that, there were some policies that grew. And this program was prepared in 1965 by the U.S. Conference of Mayors. It was called Why Heritage So Rich? I thought that was an interesting title. So out of that program, there were some recommended actions that came about, which are what we see a result of that today. So what happened as a result of that program? Well, for one, an advisory council was created on historic preservation. And what this would do is it would advise the President and Congress on preservation matters, keeping them up to date. It would also create the National Register of Historic Places and a preservation program within the Department of the Interior. It would also contribute to making tax code changes to encourage preservation. And we'll talk about that in a little while. You really needed some incentives there to be able to preserve. And it urged states to establish preservation agencies. So not just on a national level, but each state could also put into practice things that would help preserving their historic structures, and urge local governments to enact protective ordinances and to incorporate preservation policies into local plans and renewal programs. Again, that's something not unusual. Hagerstown, part of the land use ordinance is protecting historic structures, and there's certain criteria along that line too. So really a lot of good things that were enacted here. So what as a result of that happened? Well, the actions that followed was the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966 was created. The Transportation Act of 1966 basically urged Department of Transportation to avoid National Register properties unless no prudent or feasible alternative. And then Model Cities Act of 1966, it urged HUD to recognize preservation in urban renewal plans. So even not just preserving the old structures, but as growth happened, making sure we took into consideration keeping these historic structures intact as much as possible.
That's a lot of good information kind of leading us up to what we're going to talk about next, and that's Hagerstown's story. So if you're listening or watching and you live in Hagerstown, I think you'll find this very interesting. And if you're from out of the area, I think this will be more of a reason to come and stop by and visit. So The first historic district in Hagerstown was the National Register District on South Prospect Street in 1979. The story is that it was the construction of two modern homes in the middle of the street that led residents to mount the campaign for historic recognition of their neighborhood. The loss of the Rochester House in 1953 to make way for a city parking lot was often cited as something preservation advocates were trying to avoid in the future. Hagerstown's first historic district ordinance was not adopted until 1987, so it's fairly new. And this is approximately 60 years after the first district was designated in America. And at present, the city has 4 local historic districts. We got South Prospect Street, Downtown, Oak Hill, and Potomac Broadway. The South Prospect Street Historic District is a 19th and early 20th century residential neighborhood located along the crest of a hill. The street stretches for 3 blocks and is lined with more than 50 structures representing America's varied and strong architectural heritage. The buildings line a tree-shaded avenue and express a uniformity of quality and scale which ties South Prospect Street into an important urban streetscape. It is the variety of architectural styles that gives South Prospect Street its strongest and most significant character. The styles represent neoclassical, classical revival, Gothic revival, the Second Empire, and Queen Anne. The only non-domestic buildings are the St. John's Episcopal Church and the First Presbyterian Church. Both churches were erected in the early 1870s and are Gothic revival stone structures. They're very cool buildings. South Prospect Street is said to have been opened in 1832 by William D. Bell, who widened a small alley into the present street. Antietam Street is spanned by a bridge known locally as the Dry Bridge, with an ornamental metal railing and a flight of masonry steps leading down to the lower street. The bridge was rebuilt in the summer of 1976. The railing appears to date from the early 1900s and bears the name B.F. Knoll and Son, Hagerstown. Although the street has been paved in recent years, many of the early brick sidewalks still remain. So if you're ever over on that South Prospect Street side of the town, it's cool to see those brick sidewalks.
Yeah, that is a neat little area right there.
It is.
It's pretty unique. Pretty neat unique feature there in Hagerstown. So another district is the downtown district. The downtown district, just like a lot of areas, it can change a little bit just because you can see when there were times of growth in an area. And that's really true with the downtown district. When we're thinking about the late 19th and early 20th century commercial styles of buildings down there, really you can see the evidence of the growth because these are large, ornate structures. And what that's really evidence of is that at that time, Hagerstown really grew into a leading manufacturing city and a rail center in Maryland. So naturally, you have population growth, you have economic growth. There's this large commercial boom that appeared between 1880 and 1920. And because of all of this growth and this generation of revenue, it was reflected in the development of these large buildings. And so you see a transformed downtown area that included large hotels, catering to rail, automobile travelers, and there were commercial establishments, either remodeled or newly built to reflect the prosperity. And so we see a lot of these buildings that are evidence of that in downtown Hagerstown. And like you were mentioning with the other district there, South Prospect area, much the same. A lot of these structures, 2- and 3-story buildings, had Italian influences. You had lots of really ornate cornice work, neoclassical forms of architecture, and a very simple early 20th century commercial style with rectangles and a lot of different shapes. And so a lot of these things really make these buildings unique. And some pivotal buildings in the district are, as an example, the Washington County Courthouse, Hagerstown City Hall, and these really the buildings that stemmed from, that caused a lot of commercial growth along West Washington Street and North Potomac Streets. There's a lot of significant historic buildings, contributing structures in Hagerstown as well, which include the Maryland Theater, First Hosed Fire Company, Colonial Theater, Masonic Temple, Barnwood Books Building, St. John's Lutheran Church. Really, you could go on the old library, Roslyn, you could just keep going on a number of these structures that really, because of the boom in that time period, that just beautiful work.
Right, and it's kind of like you mentioned before. And one of the other cities is you start to see some of the modernization mix with the historic parts of these buildings, and it's really cool. So, yeah. The next district is the Oak Hill district, and this one's I was really interested in learning a lot about because I do a lot of my inspections out in this area. So the Oak Hill Historic District is an early to mid 20th century residential neighborhood. Historically, the district is associated with a period that's between 1900 and 1941, in which Hagerstown experienced industrial and population growths unprecedented in the city's history. The district is also important for its association with persons significant in local history. Oak Hill was the home to many, if not to most, of the city's industrial, commercial, social, and cultural leaders. The Oak Hill district addition to Hagerstown was laid out in 1909 for Mrs. Clara Hamilton, the widow of William T. Hamilton, the governor of Maryland from 1980 to 1984. The properties were sold by the Hamiltons with covenants in the deeds affecting type, use, cost, siting, and settings of the buildings. Only residential structures were allowed. The minimum cost of a house was designated at $2,500, which is crazy to think about if you look at these buildings now and the cost back then. Objectionable and unsightly outbuildings were forbidden. And Mrs. Hamilton also retained rights to the trees lining the streets. It is interesting to think about the people that may have resided in some of these houses over the years. It's crazy. Yeah. So architecturally, the houses in the district represent examples of the major architectural styles popular for residential construction in the first third of the 20th century. The houses are generally colonial or Georgian revival and stylistic influences, although excellent examples of Spanish and Tudor revival, Foursquare, Queen Anne, Dutch colonial revival, and arts and crafts bungalows are present. The buildings include some of the finest examples of these styles found in Hagerstown and collectively exhibit a range of architectural expression, craftsmanship, and technique of that period. And from the point of community planning, the Oak Hill area is important as the first and only significant section of Hagerstown to be developed along the lines of the Garden City movement that began in the country in the mid-19th century. The district is characterized by large lots, open spaces, deep setbacks, curving streets, and tree-lined boulevards. So that's some information on the Oak Hill district. Very interesting place.
Yeah, I'm in Oak Hill a lot as well, and that is a unique area. I often wondered what was behind how that was designed because it's very unique.
It is.
The street layouts and so forth. It's enjoyable just to drive.
It is.
Yeah. And then finally we have the the Potomac Broadway Historic District. I was thinking, this is an area that people see all the time, and really you can see a stark difference within a block of different designs of these neighborhoods and structures. And basically this area, this Potomac Broadway district, is largely of a late 19th and early 20th century residential area. Most of these buildings dating from 1870 to 1930. Again, you find a lot of variety of historical architectural styles in many of these buildings, some of which you just mentioned. But again, you look at this area, for example, the west side of North Potomac Street, that is unique, where you've got these large mansions just sitting way off the street, long driveways, treed front lots, very unique. And then you have the homes on the east side of North Potomac Street in Oak Hill, and on Broadway and North Avenue, very small front yards, quite different than nearby these mansions. And then you have the townhouses on Lower Potomac Street, North Locust Street. They're right up against the sidewalk. You've got house, sidewalk, street, right? So really all of those just in that small area really just again give evidence of how the city grew at one time. And so it does a really good job of portraying the growth and development in Hagerstown from the late 19th century through its major commercial industrial boom, which was from about 1880 to the 1930s. So when we think about, for example, the kind of narrow it down a little bit, take for example the 400 block of North Potomac Street and 600 block of Oak Hill Avenue. Those particular homes were the homes of Hagerstown business leaders who either created or rode the tide of the economic boom to great prosperity. And then the district was also home to the likes of people who were in the insurance business, jewelers, executives. I had a number of manufacturing companies and banking establishments. And so you had a number of business people that, again, contributed to the growth of the community. And where you'll find this district is between the Oak Hill and downtown historic districts. So again, just an amazing area of the city. If you just drive it, look at it, and kind of see what I'm talking about, you'll see, oh yeah, it's quite a difference.
Yeah, and I enjoyed listening to that because that's another area that I do a lot of inspections in, and is one of a kind, that is for sure. And so now we'll talk about City Park. You know, the City Park neighborhood is a National Register district, but not a local district. The historic City Park is home to the Jonathan Hager House and Museum, the original homestead of the city's founder, Jonathan Hager. City Park is a picturesque collection of man-made lakes, wooded walking trails, picnic facilities, and active recreation facilities. It is also home to the Washington County Museum of Fine Arts, and the Hagerstown Railroad Museum and Engine 202. And also the Mansion House Art Center is located there at City Park. The travel website escapehere.com recently named City Park as one of the 10 most beautiful city parks. That's pretty nice accomplishment for Hagerstown there. And much of the urban core is recognized as historic in an overarching Hagerstown National Register Historic District. Only the 4 local districts and 8 local landmark properties are subject to architectural controls with review and approval of exterior plans by the Hagerstown Historic District Commission. The commission uses locally adopted design guidelines modeled on federal standards to review plans to ensure decisions are predictable and consistent. The goal being to protect the character of our historic districts and the historic buildings that contribute to the character of those districts. You know, in some history on Hagerstown history, if we have piqued your interest, just mentioning historic districts, you should come to Hagerstown and see it firsthand.
Yeah, I agree, and I keep learning more and more about some of these buildings. So, yeah, it's an amazing thing. I think, you know, even if you're not that interested in history, it does make you appreciate a little more. You just don't take
absolutely.
Yeah. So
Okay.
anyway, so you know, we were talking about at the outset the fact that the goal is to preserve the existing structures.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when you think about that, that can cost money. Can be significant in the way of resources. You know, as an example, if someone were to buy a home in a historic district, and let's just say the windows needed to be replaced, you can't just go down to Lowe's and buy double hung windows. Mm-hmm. There are standards,
right?
And because of that, if you're buying a period specific window, as they say, that's custom.
Yes.
You know, so just think about that. That necessarily historic doesn't have anything to do with on the inside, but anything on the outside. Even sometimes people don't realize that they have an accessory shed that could be a contributing structure, and you don't want to assume just because it's a shed you can remove it. You know, so if in doubt, if you live in a historic district, it's good to check with your local jurisdiction to see about that. But at any rate, you know, some good information for people to know. If you live in a historic structure, residential or commercial, you're thinking about investing in one, whatever the case, it's really good to know some nice incentives, because what I mentioned as an example with the windows is that you're talking about a significant cost, and governments over the years, as we've talked about, recognize that there is a cost to it of time and money. So therefore, local governments and the like were moved to say, well, if it's going to cost more, we want them preserved, but at the same time, we recognize we need to make it easier. So why not issue things like tax credits to people, right? So there are a number of tax credits that are available for people who want to preserve structures. And there were changes to the tax code that occurred in 1976 and 1981, which basically encouraged historic preservation as a balance to stick to the architectural controls. So, if you're wanting to do that, again, especially here locally, you have a contributing structure in the Hagerstown Historic District, and you want to restore a property, if you follow the Secretary of the Interior's guidelines, then you are eligible for tax credits. So what tax credits would be available? Well, let's go through them. First of all, let's talk about the commercial or rental properties. Tax credit from a federal would be 20% of the cost of work. For the state, 20% of the cost of the work, and county, 10% of the cost of exterior work. And these credits can piggyback and can amount to 50% of a project cost. And the cost of the restoration project must amount to more than the value of the structure without the cost of the land. And this is important as well, is that the Maryland Historical Trust or the Historic District Commission must approve all restoration prior to beginning work. So the last thing you want to do is put a lot of money and time and energy into something only to find out that it didn't go as you planned. So then there's also credits related to residential property. State, 20% of the cost of the work. County, 10% of the cost of exterior work. And again, these credits piggyback and can amount to 25% of the project cost. And the cost of the restoration project must equal $5,000 and be finished in 2 years. And again, the Maryland Historical Trust or the Historic District Commission must approve all restoration prior to beginning work. So there are some nice incentives there, but there are guidelines that must be followed. And a key to all these tax credits, at least locally, is you must get the Maryland Historic Trust or the Historic District Commission's approval before work begins. So very, very important. We want to emphasize that.
Yes, definitely. I'm glad you went over those tax credits because I'm sure not everybody knows about them. And like you mentioned, before you start this work, you definitely want to reach out to those agencies to make sure it is approved. Mm-hmm. So I know that was a lot of information, a lot of good information about historic districts, why they exist, and not just here in Hagerstown, but in the United States and all over the world. And if you enjoyed this episode, we do appreciate giving us a rating. If you look for us on Apple Podcast, you can search for the Hub-Bub Podcast. You can give us a rating there, leave a comment, what you'd like to expect in future, or what you would want to listen to in future episodes. You can find us on all major podcast platforms, Apple, Google, Spotify, Anchor. And you can also watch us. If you're not watching us now, you can find us on our Facebook page by searching for the Hub-Bub Podcast, and on our YouTube channel. You can search for the Hub-Bub Podcast and you'll see our smiling faces there as well. If you're on our YouTube channel, make sure that you rate and subscribe to those videos. Give us a thumbs up. And if you hit the bell icon on YouTube, you'll be notified whenever we post a new video. So. Mm-hmm. Yep. And now Sean's favorite part of the podcast is our weird news story. So this one, The title of the article is 15 Shocking Discoveries Found When Renovating Old Homes. I'll put the link in the podcast description so you can look at all 15 for yourself. But I wanted to point out 3 of them here today. There's some good ones. So one that caught my attention was almost something like out of a movie. A couple was renovating a home and they found $23,000 in cash that was wrapped in newspapers from the 1950s. So they found this cash wrapped in a newspaper, looked at the date of the newspaper, saw it was from the 1950s. So they assumed that it's been there since then.
Yeah.
Just insane. I can't imagine. The next one was when a plumber was doing a bathroom renovation, he came across something gold. Well, it was actual gold. This gold brick was worth $50,000. And he did the right thing. He didn't take it for himself. He did give it to the homeowner, and they were very appreciative of his work. But I can't imagine working on a bathroom and just glance over and see a gold brick sitting there. But crazy things. And then the last one we'll look at deals with a historic building in Los Angeles. It is called Clifton's Diner. And while they were doing renovations, they were tearing down a wall, and they found a neon light that was still on. So researchers are saying that this light has been on for 77 years. Mm-hmm. And I did read that neon lights normally would stay on for like 40 to 44 years. So 77 years is quite some time longer. This is pretty astonishing, but the owner quickly realized the amount of money he's been paying for this darn light. He estimated that it was probably $17,000 in electric bills because of this light that he's paid over the years. So like I said, there will be a link to that article so you can explore all 15 of those shocking discoveries for yourself. So
that is crazy stuff.
It is wild.
Yeah, I lived in a house that in Virginia that was a turn of the century house. And I did some renovation work on these. I wasn't in a historic district. I was just outside of historic, like a couple of blocks. But I never found anything. Yeah.
Bummer.
Yeah.
Maybe you weren't looking hard enough.
Yeah. I wasn't gonna look that hard. But anyway. All right. So now our musical guest. How about some Hot Fun?
Hot Fun sounds great.
Yeah, that's the name of the band.
Oh, okay.
Hot
cool.
Fun. Yeah. You didn't know that. But anyway, yeah, Western Maryland's premier dance party band. That's their goal, is to get you up and dancing.
Wow.
So that Hot Fun band consists of 5 members: Morgan, Alec, Keith, and Kenny, all natives of Hagerstown. Of course, with pandemic, they're not playing too much. Mm-hmm. But historically, they've played a number of venues. And they play several genres of music from the 70s to modern. They really pride themselves on really connecting with the audience. So if you get on YouTube and check out their videos, they really, really engage the audience, getting people up and active. So, but anyway, they've done a couple of remote performances themselves, even so they can't get together, but they'll put something together. So yeah, check them out on social media, Facebook and the like. hotfunband.com. So we'll listen to them in a moment, but just to kind of give a teaser for next month's podcast. Next month's podcast is going to deal with consumer protection when it comes to recalls. So that will be a really important one.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that one, getting the message out there.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a huge safety factor there, a lot of good information there. So look forward to that next month. Please tune in for that. But for now, let's be introduced to the Hot Fun Band.